Hello, we're back. In episode 6, I said we would be talking about the invader port to the Commodore 64, programmed in BASIC, then compiled for speed using the Laser BASIC compiler. First, we'll take a look at Commodore BASIC with the Vice emulator on a PC in Windows. It emulates several Commodore computers, including the Commodore 128, the Commodore Plus/4, the Commodore VIC-20, and the original Commodore PET, and of course the Commodore 64, seen here. What's interesting is that Commodore BASIC was created by Microsoft, known as Microsoft, hyphenated at the time. They also created versions of BASIC for Radio Shack's TRS-80 and the Apple II around the same time. One of the issues that made programming tough on these old machines is that with only 40 columns and 25 lines, it's hard to see very much of your code at once. So back in the day, I found myself constantly printing out my program to help me find bugs, etc. In a later episode, you'll see that the Commodore VIC-20 was even more limited when it came to screen real estate. Here's what Invader on the Commodore 64 in BASIC looks like. You can see it's pretty hard to read. Also, you only get 2 character variables. That doesn't sound like that much of a limitation, but it can be hard to keep track of what they meant at times. So I marked up my printout to help with this. Here's an example of what that looks like. I really wanted to create this version of Invader using a real Commodore 64 with these limitations, and I'll tell you, it was tough. We are so spoiled now with today's modern editors and IDEs with color coding, code completion, and other helpful tools. Here's the printout for the final Invader game in BASIC. Also, once you've learned to program in languages without line numbers, it's tough to go back to using them again. These are the data statements for the sprites. When I get to the assembly version of Invader on the Commodore 64, you'll see that I switched to a modern IDE and cross-developed it on a PC instead. It was so much easier this way. I used CBM Program Studio, shown here, an awesome development IDE created by Arthur Jordison. I'll leave a link in the description. The Commodore 64 has 8 hardware sprites at a size of 24 by 21 pixels. See how large the border is around here? I still used my 8x8 sprites for the BASIC version in hopes that it might run a little faster, with the smaller amount of pixels to move around. Later on, when I show the assembly version on the 64, you'll see I use the full arcade version of the sprites, as the assembly is so much faster. Okay, now we're going to take a look at Invader on a real Commodore 64. Let's go ahead and load up the BASIC version. Okay, we'll list it. And there it is, and we'll go ahead and run it. Now you're going to see that in BASIC it is painfully slow, not really even playable. There's only 2 sprites, well, the player, the enemy, and a projectile for each, and it's pretty much unplayable. So we'll go ahead and stop that. Okay, this time we'll go ahead and load up the compiled version. We have to use the 1 this time so that it places it in the right part of memory. As this is compiled, it's really in a machine language program. it runs quite a bit faster, but still not blazingly fast. You'll also notice that I bump up against the edge by right here, and I'm bumping up against the edge of the screen right here. Now the reason for that is this is an 8-bit computer, and you can only poke numbers from 0 to 255 into these addresses. So the screen ends, or 255 ends up being around here, and you have to poke a number into an address in order to utilize the rest of the width of the screen. And to keep it simple, I just went ahead and moved the game into the center of the screen for this demo. I can go into further explanation about that later on, but we'll go ahead and show you what it looks like when we lose all our lives and we have to use the F1 button in order to start a new game. So another interesting thing is I'm using an SD card reader on a 40-year-old computer. I'll leave a link in the description to where you can find one of these, and this looks like a little copy of a disk drive for the Commodore 64. Funny thing is, the Commodore 64 disk drive was larger, slightly larger than the Commodore 64 itself, and it had a 6502 CPU in it as well. I showed that in a previous episode. This is the 6510, actually a variant of that. You can see that the CPU isn't much smaller than the SD drive that I'm using nowadays. So back in the 80s, when you designed sprites for these machines, you would first design them on graph paper with colored pencils, and then do the math to create the data statements for each line of the sprite. But now there are tools to make this easier, as seen here. I use Spritemate and PETSCII. This is Spritemate, and you can see two animation frames of the invader right here. And this is PETSCII. I can also animate this. It's very tiny, but you can see it right there on the screen, animating. And it's switching, of course, between these two frames. The nice thing about these is that they will allow you to save in a format that can be dumped right into a Commodore assembly or basic program, and both of these have this ability. As you can see here. I also put together what I call my C64 Micro using a Raspberry Pi Zero 2W, and also have both a The C64 Mini and a The C64, which are modern takes on the Commodore 64. I'm going to save them to show with my Commodore 64 assembly version episode coming up soon. Anyhow, I'm not the greatest programmer, but I am capable of coding some slightly more complicated games than my Invader demo, so I thought I'd show you some of my work. Here are some of my Pico 8 demos. This is an Atari 2600 Asteroids programmed on the Pico 8 to look like the Atari 2600 version. Oh. And here's my Burger Time demake. You can see I can drop burger ingredients on the enemies. There we go. Took him out and dropped all the ingredients down, and now what I'll do is drop him with the top bun here. He can walk out on a crosshair and I can drop him. And here I'll trigger picking up an extra life. There I used a pepper, so pick up an extra life. So all the functionality is there. I just have to flesh this out with levels and add some more enemies in there. And let's see. Oh, can't show you that one yet. I'm going to show you now. This is interesting because in the first episode I talked about iterating through tables so that I could have more than a single enemy. So I have jumped ahead. Look at this. Here is a fully playable, albeit without sound, invader game. So I have all the invaders. They're marching along and bouncing back and forth off the edges. And I can also take out these bunkers, and so can the aliens. Now, there's a really interesting thing that I found out about that saucer that flies across the top when I started creating the graphics for this. And that is when you shoot the saucer, you actually see a little invader inside of there. And I can show you that that's true in the arcade version as well, so it's really cool. So I went ahead and duplicated that in my game as well. So when you shoot the saucer, it blows up and it looks like this, and there's a little invader in there. Also, I think I have one more I can show you here. This is my take on a Mario level as well. Okay, so there's Mario. He can jump and collect coins. There is no collision detection with the Koopa right now. There's another coin. When you pick up the key on this platform in a second here, you'll see it goes up into the interface to show that you have it. And that would be a mushroom maybe later on, and there's a bullet bill. And you can't climb yet, you can't go down the tubes. But if you have all the coins and you make it to the end, you get a little victory sign there. Another game that you got a sneak peek of in my first episode is Jumper, a remake of an old Game & Watch game. Here it's recreated on the Playdate. I'll show some more of my work in progress in future episodes. I already showed you an almost fully functional Invaders game in this episode, along with some other games in Pico 8. But next episode I will be showing a port of Invader to Pico 8 on both the Raspberry Pi in Linux and on the PC in Windows. Until then, bye. I'll talk to you next time.